The troposphere above the European continent in the late autumn of 1943 was a profoundly hostile environment fundamentally incompatible with human survival. At an altitude of 28,000 feet, the ambient temperature routinely plummeted to -60 degrees Fahrenheit and the atmospheric pressure dropped to less than a third of what it was at sea level. This was the silent, freezing battleground of the 8th Air Force, a domain where the basic laws of physics, thermodynamics, and human physiology conspired against the young men who populated the heavy bomber fleets. On the 29th of November 1943, this unforgiving environment bore witness to an event of incomprehensible mechanical violence and miraculous survival. The Boeing B-17 flying fortress named Rikki Tikki Tavi, belonging to the 359th Bombardment Squadron, was engaged in a massive daylight precision bombing raid against the heavily defended industrial infrastructure of Bremen, Germany. As the bomber stream navigated the lethal corridors of German anti-aircraft fire, a catastrophic structural failure occurred. The aircraft sustained massive battle damage, severing the primary control cables and shattering the structural integrity of the fuselage. In a fraction of a second, the B-17 broke apart violently in the thin air. The tail section, consisting of roughly 12 feet of uninsulated aluminum, unpowered and detached from the wings and engines, sheared away entirely from the main fuselage. Inside this tumbling, severed piece of wreckage, 19-year-old Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran, the assigned tail gunner, was still alive. His parachute had been shredded by shrapnel during the attack, and his designated escape hatch was irrevocably jammed by the twisted metal of the collapsing airframe. Moran was trapped in an unpowered metal cylinder falling 4 miles toward the Earth with absolutely no mechanism for escape. The story of Eugene Moran falling 28,000 feet in the severed tail of a heavy bomber is an extreme anomaly of aerodynamic physics and human endurance, but the sheer brutality of the position he occupied was not an anomaly. It was a calculated, engineered reality. The tail gunner of a Boeing B-17 occupied the most physically isolating and psychologically taxing combat station in the history of aerial warfare. To understand the profound physical and psychological toll inflicted upon these aviators, one must examine the specific architectural design of the bomber itself. The Boeing engineers, prioritizing aerodynamic efficiency and interlocking fields of defensive fire, designed the tail gunner station as an afterthought of human comfort. The gunner was forced to crawl over the retractable tail wheel assembly, moving through a narrow, dark tunnel in the aft fuselage to reach his combat station. Once in position, he was completely cut off from the rest of the 10-man crew. The waist gunners, the radio operator, and the flight deck were located far forward, separated by bulkheads and the deafening roar of 4 Wright Cyclone radial engines. The tail gunner's only connection to his comrades was a fragile rubberized umbilical cord providing his oxygen and a frequently unreliable intercom wire that was often severed by enemy fire or the extreme vibration of the airframe. The physical dimensions of the tail gunner's workspace were agonizingly restrictive. The station was roughly the volume of a standard telephone booth, tapering sharply to accommodate the aerodynamic lines of the rudder and elevators. The gunner did not sit in a conventional seat. Instead, he knelt on custom-fitted leather pads or perched precariously on a rudimentary bicycle seat suspended by a single metal pipe. He was forced into a permanent forward-leaning crouch, his knees absorbing the continuous violent turbulence of high-altitude flight while his hands gripped the dual spade grips of his twin 50-caliber Browning M2 heavy machine guns. He maintained this agonizing posture for missions that routinely lasted between 8 and 10 hours. But the physical cramping was merely the beginning of the tail gunner's ordeal. The environmental conditions within the unpressurized, unheated tail compartment were lethal. At combat altitudes, the slipstream outside the thin plexiglass windows rushed past at over 200 miles per hour, stripping any residual heat from the aluminum skin of the aircraft. The military attempted to mitigate this freezing environment by issuing the F-2 and F-3 electrically heated flight suits. These garments resembled heavy quilted coveralls wired with complex networks of copper heating coils designed to plug directly into the bomber's electrical system. Theoretically, they were supposed to keep the gunner warm while allowing him the mobility to operate his weapons. In practice, the technology was disastrously unreliable. The fragile copper wires embedded in the fabric frequently snapped under the constant movement of the gunner or short-circuited due to the condensation that formed and instantly froze inside the aircraft. When a heated suit failed at -60 degrees, the onset of frostbite was not measured in hours but in minutes. The ambient cold was so severe that exposed skin would instantly freeze to the metal surfaces of the machine guns. If a gunner needed to clear a jammed cartridge and removed his heavy shearling leather gloves, his fingers would be permanently damaged before he could resolve the mechanical malfunction. By the winter of 1943, military medical records indicated that an astonishing 75% of all frostbite casualties in the 8th Air Force were caused directly by the failure of these electrically heated suits and not by exposure to the elements alone. Coupled with the agonizing cold was the ever-present terror of hypoxia. Because the B-17 was unpressurized, the crew relied entirely on an unheated continuous flow oxygen system. The tail gunner wore an A-14 rubber oxygen mask strapped tightly to his face, connected by a corrugated rubber hose to a fixed regulator panel on the fuselage wall. The moisture from the gunner's own breath would frequently accumulate in the exhaust valves of the mask and instantly freeze, blocking the flow of life-sustaining oxygen. A tail gunner had to constantly massage his mask, breaking up the ice crystals to prevent suffocation. If the oxygen supply was interrupted either by a frozen valve or an enemy shell severing the primary lines, the gunner had less than 2 minutes of useful consciousness before the lack of oxygen caused irreversible brain damage and death. The isolation of the tail position meant that if the gunner passed out from hypoxia, the rest of the crew would likely not realize it until it was too late. There was no one to monitor his condition, no one to plug him into a portable bailout bottle. He was entirely alone in the freezing dark, managing his own survival while simultaneously defending the rear hemisphere of the bomber formation. The defensive responsibility placed upon the shoulders of the tail gunner was absolute. General Curtis LeMay, the architect of the combat box formation doctrine, realized that the only way heavy bombers could survive daylight penetrations into German airspace without long-range fighter escort was to mass their defensive firepower. The combat box arranged dozens of B-17s into a staggered three-dimensional grid designed to create overlapping fields of machine gun fire that no enemy interceptor could safely penetrate. The tail gunner was the critical anchor of this defensive grid. He guarded the most vulnerable and mathematically predictable approach vector, the direct 6 o'clock pursuit. For the first 2 years of the strategic bombing campaign, the standard tactic of the German Luftwaffe was the rear echelon attack. Pilots of the Focke-Wulf 190 and the Messerschmitt 109 would utilize their superior speed to approach the bomber stream from behind, leveling off and opening fire with their heavy cannons. In these engagements, the tail gunner was literally the first man in the crosshairs. He was staring directly into the engine cowlings and the flashing gun ports of the approaching German fighters. The mathematics of these aerial duels were terrifyingly skewed. The American tail gunner was armed with two 50 caliber Browning machine guns. These weapons were masterpieces of industrial engineering, capable of firing an 800-grain armor-piercing incendiary projectile at nearly 3,000 feet per second. The Browning was accurate and possessed a high rate of fire, but it was ultimately a kinetic energy weapon relying on physical impact to damage the heavily armored engines or pilot compartments of the attacking fighters. The German interceptors, by contrast, were armed with 20mm Mauser cannons firing a specialized type of ammunition known as the Minengeschoss or mine shell. Unlike standard solid armor-piercing rounds, the mine shell was manufactured from thin-drawn steel and filled with a massive charge of high explosive. The Luftwaffe Operational Research Division calculated that it required an average of 20 direct hits from these highly destructive 20mm shells to compromise the structural integrity of a B-17 from the rear due to the massive overlapping layers of aluminum bulkheads, control cables, and armor plating protecting the engines. However, this statistical survivability of the aircraft offered absolutely no solace to the tail gunner. He was positioned at the absolute extreme rear of the aircraft, completely exposed behind a single pane of bullet-resistant armored glass that was frequently shattered by the sheer concussive force of the German cannon shells. When a 20mm mine shell detonated inside the confined space of the tail compartment, the results were catastrophic. The high explosive charge would tear the thin aluminum skin of the bomber to shreds, sending a lethal spray of jagged metal spall ricocheting through the uninsulated compartment. The tail gunner had no heavy armor plating to protect his back or his sides. He wore a heavy flak suit composed of overlapping manganese steel squares sewn into a canvas vest, but this garment was incredibly heavy, restricting his movement, and was largely ineffective against the direct impact of heavy cannon fire. The sheer volume of lead and high explosive directed at the tail section meant that the rear gunner suffered one of the highest mortality rates of any crew position in the heavy bomber fleets. The Royal Air Force conducting brutal night bombing operations with their Avro Lancaster and Handley Page Halifax bombers experienced similar horrific attrition, losing over 20,000 rear gunners during the course of the war. As the war progressed and the American bomber crews became more proficient at defending the rear approach, the Luftwaffe realized that trailing the bomber stream was becoming too costly. German fighter commanders, specifically men like Egon Mayer, analyzed the defensive architecture of the B-17 and realized that while the tail was heavily defended, the frontal hemisphere was critically vulnerable. Early models of the Flying Fortress lacked mechanized nose turrets, relying instead on flexible socket-mounted machine guns operated by the navigator and bombardier, who were not dedicated gunners. Furthermore, the closing speed of a head-on attack, where the bomber and the fighter were flying directly at each other at a combined speed of over 500 miles per hour, reduced the engagement window to mere fractions of a second, making it incredibly difficult for the American gunners to track and hit the incoming fighters. The Luftwaffe shifted its primary intercept tactics, instructing its pilots to fly ahead of the bomber stream, execute a sharp 180-degree turn, and attack the formations directly from the 12 o'clock position. This shift in tactics mathematically altered the vulnerability of the bomber. The Luftwaffe calculated that while it took 20 cannon shells to destroy a B-17 from the rear, it only took 4 or 5 direct hits from the front to achieve a fatal kill. A frontal attack targeted the unarmored plexiglass nose, the exposed cockpit, the oxygen reservoirs, and the massive radial engines, directly bypassing the heavily reinforced rear fuselage. When the German fighters executed these head-on passes, they would sweep through the bomber formation with terrifying speed, their cannons tearing the leading aircraft to pieces. But the tail gunner, despite the shift in primary enemy tactics, remained trapped in his isolated freezing compartment facing backward. He was forced to endure the psychological horror of hearing the deafening roar of the enemy engines passing just feet above his canopy, hearing the frantic screams of his crewmates over the static-filled intercom as the front of the aircraft was ripped apart, and being completely unable to bring his own weapons to bear on the attackers until they had already completed their pass and were diving away into the clouds. The absolute helplessness of sitting in the tail while the front of your aircraft was being destroyed by head-on passes compounded the already profound psychological trauma of the position. The statistical reality of serving in the 8th Air Force during the height of the strategic bombing campaign was a grim exercise in probability. In 1943, a bomber crew was assigned a standard combat tour of 25 missions. This arbitrary number was established by the Psychological Warfare Division to give the crews a theoretical finish line, a point at which they could be rotated back to the United States. However, the mathematical reality of surviving 25 missions was incredibly bleak. During the brutal unescorted daylight raids over targets like Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and Bremen, the casualty rates frequently exceeded 10% per mission. If a crew faced a 10% chance of being shot down on every single raid, the statistical probability of surviving 25 consecutive missions was roughly 1 in 4. The young men manning these aircraft, whose average age across the entire heavy bomber fleet was precisely 21 years old, were essentially participating in a protracted, heavily mechanized lottery of death. The 8th Air Force would ultimately lose 4,754 B-17 bombers in combat operations over Europe, representing a staggering loss of industrial capital and human life. The total number of casualties suffered by the 8th Air Force operating from the damp, fog-shrouded airfields of East Anglia exceeded the total number of combat dead suffered by the entire United States Marine Corps during the entire Pacific War. The destruction of the Rikki-Tikki-Tavi over Bremen perfectly encapsulated the brutal random violence of this mechanized slaughter. When the aircraft was fundamentally compromised by anti-aircraft fire and shattered, the physical forces exerted upon the airframe were immense. The wings, containing thousands of gallons of highly volatile 100-octane aviation fuel, sheared away, the massive engines tumbled into the void, and the fuselage snapped like a fragile hollow bone. Eugene Moran, trapped in the severed tail section, experienced a terrifying sudden silence as the deafening roar of the 4 Wright Cyclones was replaced by the high-pitched shriek of the slipstream tearing through the jagged edges of the torn aluminum. The tail section, inherently unstable without the forward mass of the aircraft, began to tumble erratically through the freezing troposphere. The intense centrifugal forces generated by the tumbling wreckage pinned Moran to the bulkheads, preventing him from even attempting to force the jammed escape hatch open. He was subjected to violent gravitational forces that ruptured blood vessels and threatened to render him unconscious. The lack of oxygen at 28,000 feet should have killed him within minutes, but the rapid descent of the heavy metal wreckage plunged him back into the denser lower atmosphere just quickly enough to keep his brain marginally oxygenated. The physics of his survival defy standard aerodynamic calculations. The large horizontal stabilizers and the massive vertical tail fin of the severed section acted as a crude, highly inefficient parachute, causing the wreckage to flutter and spin rather than plummet like a dense aerodynamic stone. This chaotic fluttering motion drastically reduced the terminal velocity of the falling tail section. Furthermore, Moran was incredibly fortunate in the specific topography of his impact zone. The tail section did not strike the hard concrete of a German city or the unyielding surface of an open field. Instead, it crashed through the dense, thick canopy of a mature pine forest in the German countryside. The heavy branches of the ancient trees, acting as a massive biological shock absorber, progressively decelerated the tumbling wreckage, shearing away the aluminum skin and absorbing the immense kinetic energy of the impact before the crushed remnants of the tail finally slammed into the soft forest floor. Eugene Moran survived a 4-mile free fall inside a metal box, suffering a fractured skull, multiple crushed vertebrae, and severe internal lacerations. He was immediately captured by German forces, and despite his horrific injuries, he survived the brutally primitive medical treatment provided by his captors and endured the remainder of the war as a prisoner in a Stalag Luft camp. Moran's miraculous survival is a legendary footnote in the history of the air war, but it serves to illuminate the absolute vulnerability of the thousands of tailgunners who did not survive. The men who operated the twin Browning machine guns in the frozen tails of the flying fortresses were the unsung, highly disposable guardians of the strategic bombing campaign. They were asked to sit alone in the dark, surrounded by the deafening noise of industrial warfare, freezing to the touch of their own equipment, breathing through freezing rubber hoses, and waiting for the mathematical certainty of an enemy fighter attack. They watched their friends in neighboring bombers explode into expanding spheres of orange flame and black smoke, fully aware that their own aircraft could suffer the same fate at any given second. They experienced the war not as a grand strategic maneuver, but as a terrifying, deeply personal struggle against the element's mechanical failure and the flashing cannons of the Luftwaffe. The brutal reality of their existence, isolated in the extreme rear of the bomber formation, stands as one of the most harrowing and unvarnished examples of human endurance required to execute the devastating, unyielding demands of total war.